Hi, so welcome. Is it Dr. Andrew or Andrew? What would you like to be called?
Well, you can call me Andrew. I have a doctorate degree, but it's in law, so it wouldn't be.
Oh, okay. Just wanted to make sure I gave you the proper respect.
I appreciate that.
So, Andrew, tell me a little bit about what you do. I understand you work with OCD. How's that? What do you do exactly?
So I am a mental health clinician, and I focus primarily on OCD and anxiety. And that's something that I've been doing for several years. It is a very unique area when it comes to mental health, but it's something that I really enjoy working with. And I sort of fell into it years ago because I had a client with OCD and I started to learn about what it was and how to treat it. And then I just sort of went, full way into it. And now that's what I do.
And tell me a little bit about how you got into the field initially. I mean, why did you decide to focus on this in particular?
Mhm. So I have always been a person who enjoys figuring out how people think and what makes them do what they do. And so that's what got me into counseling in the first place. When I was practicing law, I did litigation and trial law because I liked working with the jury for the same purpose, to understand how people interact. And so when I got into mental health counseling, OCD was such a unique type of issue to work with, and it was really challenging. But one of the benefits of OCD is that a client can come in and they can be really distressed and really having a hard time with it. But the treatment methodologies that we have available today are pretty good. And you can take someone from this really bad place and in a relatively short period of time, everyone is different, but maybe 2, 3 months, move them to an area where they don't have all that distress anymore. So I really like that. That's what got me doing more of it.
That's incredible. And what would you say was the biggest challenge about doing this?
The biggest challenge about OCD is one of the primary treatments is called, excuse me, exposure and response prevention. And what that means is that a client may come in and they say, oh, I'm afraid that I am contaminated with things. And so I have to keep washing my hands to make sure that I'm clean. And the treatment, exposure and response prevention, means that you have to expose them to the things that lead to the distress feeling that they have. And then when they typically will do something like wash their hands, which is called a compulsion, to make themselves feel less distressed, you have to not let them do that compulsion. So they'll come in with their anxiety level here, and you expect in treatment that their anxiety level is going to go up to here, and then it starts to come down. But you've got to be able to accept the fact that your role is to make your client feel more distressed so that they can feel less distressed. That's hard for some people.
Gotcha. And what is a treatment for each? Obviously, treatment for each person is different, but are there different forms of OCD? Because you see someone like Howie Mandel that talks about it quite a bit with the germs and the washing hands, where he won't touch people. He'll do the fist pump instead of shaking hands. Then you have it on television. You have like this television show Monk where that was featured.
Mhm.
And I'm going to get into that in a minute to talk about how accurate that is. But how is each form of OCD different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love those examples. And I'll tell you why. Because you have a couple different things out there. So first you have OCD. And OCD has a lot of different ways that it shows up. So it can be someone who is concerned about contamination. It can be someone who needs things to be symmetrical. It can be someone who's concerned that they might harm somebody. There's hit and run OCD where they think they hit somebody with their car and they need to go back and check, and on and on and on and on. So there's a lot of types of OCD. The other thing is called obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And that's very similar to what we call symmetry OCD, or sometimes people can say just right OCD. And the question then becomes, so then what's the difference? If it's the same in two things, what's the difference? The difference is that a person who has OCD, and maybe they have symmetry OCD where they want everything to be lined up, They don't want to feel that way. They
Right, right,
they are distressed by that. They still have to do it because something in their mind is saying you got to do this, but they don't want to. When you talk about OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they actually do want to do that. But the problem is that it gets to the extreme to the point they have trouble functioning. So two
right, right.
very different things that look the same.
Yes. Now, also, there's also the ones that they're like neat freaks. I know, and the David Beckham's talked about this as well. With always having to clean and clean, clean, clean. Would that be the personality OCD or would that be regular OCD?
Well, so it comes down to why are they doing it? From what
Right.
I understand, from what I've learned about what David Beckham is dealing with, it sounds like it's something that he feels that he has to do, but doesn't necessarily want to have to do. So that would fall in the OCD camp, not the OCPD camp.
Gotcha. And what about Howie Mandel? I know you said he discussed this quite a bit with him. He's very open about his OCD.
Mhm.
Which one would he fall under, just out of curiosity?
So that would be regular OCD because if when you're talking about germs, for example, or contamination, which is a very common OCD, type that you'll hear about, when you talk about OCPD, the personality disorder, that typically is always about things being lined up right. Things have to be the right way. It doesn't necessarily apply so often. You're not going to see it with germs and the other types of things. That's going to be more of the OCD.
Gotcha. And what's the difference? I've heard this before. It's that they not don't exactly have OCD, but they have OCD tendencies. What exactly is that? Because I've heard about that as well.
Well, the deeper you dive into this, the more interesting it gets.
Yes, I'm very interested.
So, you know, basically, let me kind of lay it out this way. You have OCD and OCPD that we've talked about.
Hmm.
You then have some people who are on the autism spectrum that can exhibit certain things that look like OCD. And in a good number of cases, there are people that both have OCD and are on the spectrum. Then you got to figure out why are they doing this so that you understand whether it's coming from the autism issue or whether it's coming from OCD. So those can be complicated cases. And then you have other people who just maybe they have like generalized anxiety. They like things to be clean and orderly. It's not to the extreme, but it's something about them they're uncomfortable if it's not. So really a lot of this comes down to having someone who understands all the differences and knows how to diagnose appropriately. And a lot of the diagnosis comes down to what's the reason that they're doing it. So it can get really complicated.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that next. You actually took the words out of my mouth. I was asking, is it connected with anxiety or being on the spectrum, autism, Asperger's, and stuff like that? Is it OCD connected with that, and do they go hand in hand?
So I actually just did a YouTube video that I posted this morning about autism spectrum and OCD. And there are a good number of people who have both. And the challenge is in autism, there's this need in some cases for things to be kind of lined up right and the symmetry and the same thing every day. And they do that. If it's coming from autism, they do that to soothe themselves and calm themselves. If they're doing it and they tell you, well, I have to do this and I don't want to do it, but I can't stop doing it, then you're talking OCD. So, it's the same thing. And if you just look at it, they're doing the same behavior. But the question is, why are they doing it? And then that helps you understand what's going on so that you know what treatment methodology to use. So like I said, it can get really kind of fuzzy and complicated in there.
Yes. And kind of piggybacking off the anxiety question, could something trigger OCD or OCD personality disorder? Again, I'm going back to the monk example, when he was triggered when his wife died on the show. Spoiler alert, sorry people. I mean, I know it aired 13 years ago, but I guess nobody watched. But, or like in a traumatic event, like something happened where they face that, could that trigger something like that?
Yeah, and
As
that's a great question. And here's my answer. In my practice, I've dealt with a lot of different people with OCD. And so much so that I tell people I break it down into two main types of OCD. Now, I have not seen any scientific studies that break it down this way, and I've been looking. But what I see in reality is two. The first one is someone who will say to you, ever since I was a kid, I've always had these types of things. I've had these obsessive thoughts and I had to do these things. And it's something that typically, if you say, well, is there someone in your family who also had OCD? Typically, you're going to find my mom, my dad, my aunt, my grandmother, somebody also had OCD. The second type that I see a lot is someone will have some sort of a traumatic event. And as a result of that traumatic event, they start to have OCD where they might be ruminating over something or worrying about a particular thing. And it's really hard for them to get past it. Now, if you look at the actual science of what we do know about where OCD comes from, the answer is we really don't know where OCD comes from. I'm not saying that OCD comes from trauma, because I don't believe that would be scientifically correct, but I do see people who maybe have OCD tendencies that maybe get triggered by a trauma, or you have people who like always had OCD, and when they get into a high stress situation, it tends to trigger more obsessive thoughts and things. So that's the best answer I can give you on that.
Gotcha. And then going back to Monk, how accurate was it? I've always truly wanted to know this. How accurately was it portrayed on the show, or was it exaggerated for entertainment value?
So I watched the show because obviously,
Yeah.
being in the field, I had to watch the show. Um, there are people that would exhibit what he was exhibiting. So in some cases, that could be pretty accurate. And you can imagine trying to live your life when you have those obsessive thoughts. You have to do these certain things, even though you don't want to, and you can't get away from it. That's the thing that causes such a high level of distress. Now, in the show, the thing that was a little bit different is, he kind of did these things. He sort of had to, and they didn't really show that it caused him distress, which made me wonder maybe it's OCPD as opposed to OCD. But they didn't get into it enough for me to accurately diagnose him.
Right.
But yeah, you will find people who have such a severe case of OCD, it's really hard for them to break those obsessive routines.
And what, in your opinion, is the treatment for it? Because I know that you have your stopmyocd.com. So what, in your opinion, is the best way to, I don't want to say maybe treat it, handle it. I don't know the right terminology.
Mhm. So there's a couple things when it comes to that. So the first thing, which is sort of the primary treatment that you're most likely going to find out there, is the exposure and the response prevention that I was referencing earlier. So that's where when a person is in the OCD cycle, the cycle basically goes that they have this obsessive doubt. The obsessive doubt makes them worry about the consequences. That makes them feel this high level of distress. And as a result of the distress, they do a compulsion to try to reduce their distress. And then the compulsion wears off and they start the cycle again. So in exposure and response prevention, it focuses on the last two parts of the cycle, the distress and the compulsion, and puts you in a place where you feel the distress, you can't do the compulsion. And then the work there is learning to tolerate the distress, learning to habituate to the feelings, learning that the things you're afraid of are not going to happen. That's called inhibitory learning. So that's one. A newer model that's out there that I incorporate into my practice as well is called inference-based CBT. And what it does is it says, when we deal with OCD, there's a point in time when we're here in the real world, And there's a point in time when we move over into the OCD cycle. When we're in the real world, if you're talking about like contamination, you feel that, your hands might be dirty. In the real world, I can look at my hand and I can either see that I've got dirt on it or not. I can feel that it's sticky or not. I know whether I've touched something or not. The facts that I have will tell me whether my hands are dirty or not. When I move into the OCD world, all bets are off. Everything in the OCD world is based upon maybe, could be, possibly, might be, and there's no fact there. So you can't check it against facts because there are no facts there. It's all the possibilities. And in the OCD world, the possibilities become probabilities. It's not like it's possible my hands are dirty. It's, well, my hands are probably dirty. So the inference-based therapy works on recognizing when you're leaving the real world and moving over into the OCD world. And then there's a couple other things. Some people need medication that will help them as they're doing their therapy. And I'd say in my practice, maybe 50% of the people benefit from medication as well as a therapy. And the medication is an interesting thing because the medicines that they use are the same that they would use for depression and anxiety, but they're used at much higher doses. And so when you go for a prescription, your doctor needs to know OCD to prescribe the right, medicine. And then there's a couple other things for treatment-resistant OCD that, we could talk about if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to hear about that.
So, in a small number of cases, someone might have treatment-resistant OCD where they are just not responding to the medication, the therapy, it's just not working. First, you're going to diagnose why that is. And there could be a couple reasons. One, because they could be actually compulsing and you don't realize it because they're mentally compulsing or they're doing something. So that blocks the treatment. The other more common thing is someone at home, a parent, a loved one, a caretaker, is accommodating them, meaning that the person says, oh, I'm so stressed out because I feel that everything's contaminated. Can you wash everything down? And they're like, oh, I don't want you to feel stressed. Let me go wash everything down. And when they do that, it undoes all the treatment that they did. So those are some things you look for. And then if that's not happening, then we've got transcranial magnetic stimulation. And that's something where you would go in after other things have failed. And it's like thinking of a 1950s hair dryer, you got this thing over your head and it's got magnetic coils in it and it's focused on certain areas of the brain. And there's different studies that focus on different areas. It's still a new science. And they use that. So that's another thing. There's electroshock therapy. Again, these are in a very small number of cases. And then there's, more intensive programs. Like when I work with clients, I'll work once a week, twice a week, whatever it may be. But there's some programs that are intensive and you can go in for several hours a day and get more intensive treatment. So there's a lot of different options out there. Generally, when OCD is diagnosed correctly, generally you can get a pretty good result. I wouldn't say that you get cured, but you basically get over the worst parts of it and it doesn't impede your life anymore.
Amazing. That's incredible, the work that you do. And how do you properly get diagnosed? This is the $1,000,000 question because I know some people just say it like, oh, I have OCD, but they were never diagnosed. They just say it like, oh, teehee, I have this, which is disrespectful, by the way. But so how would you properly go about that?
So, that's a really important question as well. And this is something that I talk a lot with my colleagues about. When you are in school, whether it be for mental health counseling, social work, psychiatry, psychology, whatever it may be, it is very rare that I've ever heard of anybody tell me, oh yeah, they taught us about OCD in school. They just don't teach it in school, maybe because it's just not common enough, although it is pretty common, 1 out of 40 people. So people are not trained in it. And when I started practicing, I wasn't trained in it. And I started to learn about it. And when I started to learn about it, I realized, oh my gosh, these clients that I had, last year, year before, that was OCD, and I never noticed it because nobody trained me. So it's important that people get trained. So like I just early Wednesday of this week, I had received a grant from the Virginia Counseling Association to offer education to Virginia counselors about OCD, a basic education course. And I gave that course, and I've been doing a lot of those courses for free to educate other counselors. I actually have a webinar coming up that anyone can join. It's on June 1st, and we have a syndicated cartoonist who has OCD who's going to share her story. And people can sign up for that at stopmyocd.com/CES, and you'll see a list of the things that I have. Typically, everything I have is for free. So, it's a matter of getting the education out there, and the fact that David Beckham has now shared his story, and Howie Mandel and people with a name are starting to say, hey, I have OCD and this is what it is. That's really helpful in getting the message out. So in terms of diagnosing yourself, if you feel that you have this compulsive need about something, and then you do, obsessive need, and then you do a compulsion to make yourself feel better, and then it comes back around, that's the OCD cycle. So many times I get people who come to me and say, yeah, I've been working with my therapist for 2 years, and we've been talking about it and trying all these calming techniques, and nothing seems to work, and I can't get past it. And that's because calming techniques are not going to solve OCD. It's the opposite. You actually have to raise the distress level.
Right. Wonderful. And where can we find more about OCD, more about your company?
Okay, so there's a couple of really good resources out there. On my website, stopmyocd.com, I have a whole section about OCD, and I have OCD resources. And in those resources, I list some of the different things. There's International OCD Foundation. They have a great website with a lot of good information. There's Anxiety and Depression Association of America. They have a great website with a lot of information. All these are on my website. You can just find them easily. There's some books out there that I recommend. I offer a free support group for people with OCD, as well as family members or caregivers. Actually Saturday, tomorrow morning, we have our next session. So you can sign up for that support group at stopmyocd.com. So I try to make a one-stop shop where people can get access to resources and information. And then I also have a YouTube channel where I put up a lot of information about recent studies and common questions and all those things.
Wonderful. Well, we'll definitely be sending you a follow, Andrew. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I appreciate you, and I hope to have you again on the show soon.
Well, thank you for, giving this airtime, because it's so important for people that are suffering and they don't know what to do or where to go. So
Right,
thank
exactly.
you.
Yeah, of course, of course. Anything I can do, just let me know.
All right. Well, you have a fantastic weekend.
You too. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.